Well, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. John Lott. He's president of the Crime Prevention and Research Center, and looks like he's out in Montana. Welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Well, I was looking at your website, which is very interesting. I highly recommend it, crimeresearch.org, and you have an article about you have a comparison of the collapse of law enforcement in U.S. cities. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I think people have some rough idea what's been happening to law enforcement in the country. You go to a CVS or Walgreens or Walmart in many parts of the country, and everything's behind plexiglass. You want to go and buy something, you have to have a sales clerk come out and open it up and stand next to you while you go and read the different packages, trying to decide what it is you're going to buy. People know that that wasn't the case a few years ago. But it's more than just property crime, larceny and theft. You have violent crime. And basically what's happened is, particularly in large cities, law enforcement, as you say, has collapsed. You look at arrest rates. In the 5 years before COVID, the arrest rate for reported violent crimes in large cities of 1 million or more was 44%. It started falling in 2020, and by 2022, it was down to 20%. We've never had such a low arrest rate for violent crimes, nothing even close. And this is for reported violent crimes. This isn't for all violent crimes. And for property crimes, there was an even greater drop, well over 60% drop in the arrest rates. So, if you want to go and take it a step further, because we have estimates of the total crimes that are occurring, only 8% of total violent crimes in those cities result in arrest, and only 1% of total property crimes in those cities result in arrest. Just because somebody's arrested doesn't mean that they're charged, let alone prosecuted or convicted. And so in many parts of this country, there's essentially no risk or very little risk for criminals going and committing crimes. And so it's not too surprising to me that in those same areas, you're going to see very large increases in violent and property crimes that are occurring. It's the reason why these stores have to have plexiglass all over the place.
Okay, what you're saying is shocking. I guess we would probably have to say that this is intentional. I mean, I don't know. Do you have a comment? I know that a number of the district attorneys are funded by George Soros, and they believe that minorities are historically mistreated in America. Therefore, they should not be arrested because what about do you have a comment about the ideology behind? I mean, I'm sure that policemen want to arrest people. I mean, it's not that they don't, I mean, policemen want to do their job, right? But they're being told, is it mainly that they're being told not to arrest people, or where is this coming from?
Right. Well, it's kind of hard to get into people's motives about why they're doing certain things. I can go and talk about what the outcomes are. But obviously, over the last few years, we've had a lot of changes that have occurred. You had the defunding the police movement, which reduced police budgets. You know, a city like Chicago in 2020 reduced the number of police by like 400 positions. New York City cut its police budget by $1 billion a year. You had hundreds of millions of dollars in cuts in police budgets in Los Angeles and other places around the country. Now, in the last year or so, they've started to go back and try to hire people, but you also had a lot of retirements. You lose somebody that had 15 years of experience. If you hire a new person who's been on the job for 6 months or even a year, they're not going to be as effective as that officer that you lost. And as you say, so the numbers I was going through were for arrest rates, but obviously, as you say, there's been a lot of George Soros type prosecutors who are refusing to prosecute violent criminals. And that feeds back to some extent on the police. So, for example, in New York City, in Manhattan, Alvin Bragg has downgraded 60% of the felony cases that he has. Almost all of those downgraded from a felony to a misdemeanor. And what they're doing, overwhelmingly, those involve assaults. What makes the difference between an aggravated assault, which is a felony, and a simple assault, which is a misdemeanor, is often whether a weapon, like a firearm, is used. And as you say, they don't want to prosecute certain groups of people. And so they've made the decision not to prosecute assaults involving firearms because it disproportionately involves minorities, particularly blacks, who would be prosecuted in that case. And so the thing is, if you don't include the firearms offense, you're downgrading those cases from a felony aggravated assault to a misdemeanor simple assault. And the police see that. And they don't want the prosecutors to be yelling at them for going and sending them cases that the prosecutors then have to take the hit for, reducing the charge on it. And so they don't charge people when they're initially, they don't list it as a felony. They don't list it as a weapons offense that's there. They don't charge people, they don't arrest people for firearms offenses because they know the prosecutors aren't going to be willing to do it. And why risk your safety going and arresting somebody if they're not going to be charged? And that affects things generally too. I mean, if you think the people you arrest are going to be immediately released and not charged, that has an effect on a police willingness to go and arrest people to begin with.
Well, I mean, the Biden-Harris administration claims that crime has dropped during the past 3.5 years. Is there a connection with the research you're talking about?
Well, so there are two. I think that's false. If they were to say reported crime from the FBI fell, that would be true. But total crime has gone up, I believe. And even their measure of reported crime from the FBI is questionable. Look, there's two measures that we have of crime. There's the FBI data counting the number of crimes that are reported to police. And then you have, from the Bureau of Justice Statistics and the Department of Justice, their measure, which is the National Crime Victimization Survey, which is a massive survey, which surveys 240,000 people a year. And what you find is that in the past, prior to 2020, those two measures have generally moved up and down together. But since 2020, they've consistently gone in opposite directions. In 2022, for example, while the FBI showed a 2% drop in reported crime, the National Crime Victimization data showed a 42% increase in violent crime. And even their measure of reported crime showed a 29% increase. And so there are reasons for this. If you just take the difference between reported crime for the FBI and total crime, one of the reasons, I think, is what we've been talking about, and that's the drop in arrest rates. Whether we've known for a long time that most crimes aren't reported to police, particularly property crimes. But the problem is that if you don't think these guys are going to be arrested and punished, it reduces incentive for people to go and report those crimes. It's also gotten more difficult over time to go and report crimes. So now in many parts of the country, if you call up 911, they'll go and ask you, is it an emergency? By which they mean, is the criminal there right now committing the crime? And if the answer is no, that the criminal's already left the crime scene, then they'll go and they'll say, well, we're not going to send out a police car. If you want, you can come down to the police station and fill out a police report. And the problem is that if you make it more difficult for people to go and report crimes, they're going to report fewer crimes. Some people won't bother to go down to the police station. Before, more than a few years ago, they would have sent out a police car to your home. They're not doing that now. And so now, one confusion, I think, is that people think that calling up 911 constitutes reporting a crime. You actually have to have a police report filled out for it to go into the FBI data that's there. And the thing is, I think that's part of the reason why you see reported crimes going down for the FBI data at the same time the national crime victimization data shows an increase. Because what happens is that this national crime victimization survey, they'll ask you like 40 questions or so about the crime that's been committed. And at the end, they'll ask you, did you report this? And you'll say, yeah, I called up 911. And so they'll list it as a reported crime, even though the FBI data. And one other thing just to mention, and that is we've had a collapse, you could say, in terms of the rate that police departments are reporting data to the FBI. In 2020, 97% of police departments reported data to the FBI. By 2022, you had 31% of police departments not reporting any crime data to the FBI, and another 24% of police departments only partially reporting crime data to the FBI. So
Why is it? Why would
yeah,
they?
sure. Well, in 2021, they had a change in the reporting requirements. Basically, one of the big changes was that they wanted the data reported quarterly rather than yearly. And some of the smaller police departments may have thought that that was too much of a burden to do it. But you've had lots of very large police departments, like in 2022, New York City and Los Angeles City weren't reporting crime data to the FBI. Which is kind of startling because it's not like they don't have the data there. You can go to their website sites, they have Comstat data, and you can find their crime data by week. So it's not difficult to obtain. Now, the FBI doesn't put zeros in for all those numbers. They guess what they think the missing data is, and I think they've done a pretty poor job of guessing what those missing data are.
Okay, I'm sure for residents of those cities, life is more dangerous, more expensive. You pointed out when they go to the store, everything's locked behind a plastic barrier, and I guess that's why a lot of people are who are able to are moving to other states. I don't know if you have any comment about that.
Well, I mean, if you're in San Francisco and all the Walmarts are gone and you have, the CVS's and Walgreens closing down, I mean, surely it affects the quality of life. It's not just other issues that are occurring there. Um, we did a study for Los Angeles a while ago looking at crime by zip code. And what you found in 2020 and so is that crime was moving out of the heavily concentrated areas that had been in before. And so, obviously, as it spreads, you're going to be in areas that people weren't used to having violent crime or property crime occurring. And so some people in those areas may find it less desirable to live in California than it would have been previously.
Right. Okay, I'd like to shift our attention. I found another article on your website about AI chat, artificial intelligence chatbots are moving even further to the political left. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. Well, we had done a study in March where we had asked 16 questions of the different chatbots that are out there. 9 of them dealing with crime and policing, and 7 of them dealing with gun control type issues. So on things like on crime, we would go and ask these chatbots a question. Do you think higher arrest rates and higher conviction rates reduce violent crime? And they're giving an option. They can either strongly agree, neutral, disagree, or strongly disagree. And it's kind of startling to me, but basically all the chatbots disagree that higher arrest rates and higher conviction rates reduce crime. About half of them strongly disagree that that's the case. So, I mean, I'm an economist. Basically, it's the notion of something's more costly, people do less of it. And it kind of is the backdrop for what you and I have been talking about up till this point. You increase arrest rates, you'll make it riskier for criminals to commit crime, and you'll see less crime that will be occurring. So, it's just a question of why they would believe that, but they believe that. And there are other questions like, do you think the death penalty reduces crime? And of course, they don't think that that's the case. You ask whether voter IDs will reduce vote fraud, and of course, they don't think that that's the case. Um, Basically, all the chatbots are liberal to varying degrees on average with regard to the crime questions that we have
So
there.
the AI chatbots went to a leftist university, or they're
Well,
programmed.
they basically, it's like Google's news search to some extent.
Right.
So Google, if you do use Google news search, the articles, and you want to ask them a question, the articles that will come up will primarily be from places like the New York Times and Washington Post. Something that you may want to use, if it shows up at all, maybe on page 10 of it. We've seen this in many areas. When Robert F. Kennedy was running in the Democratic primaries, if you were going to ask a question about what candidates are running in the Democratic primaries, Google had it set up so his name wouldn't even come up in the searches there. So, you go and weight different information or different sources for information, then the chatbots who go and train on those things will come up with answers based on what the programmers say is reliable sources that are there. And the thing is, everybody from reporters to students to researchers and others are using these AI chatbots, some of them more heavily than others, to do their work for them, write up their essays and what have you. And so, it affects lots of things. I can only imagine what impact things like Google News searches has had on elections. If people are trying to educate themselves about a particular issue or a candidate, and all the searches come up, tilted towards one side of the spectrum, I assume it must be worth at least a few percentage points in terms of the outcome. I mean, you just had the new Reagan movie that comes out, and Facebook and whatever were censoring their ads that they tried to put out on it, saying that it would influence the election, even though, as Randy Quaid has pointed out, Reagan hasn't been on the ballot for 40 years. And he also pointed out that the fact that they were censoring him also influences the election. If they think that the movie was going to influence the election one way or the other. So, it's just interesting. So I'm just saying it's the same type of control of information with these chatbots that you see with things like Google News Search that's there. And then we asked 7 questions that dealt with gun control issues, everything from concealed carry to assault weapons bans. People can see the list of all the 16 questions on our website at crimeresearch.org, and see what the average answers are to each and how the different chatbots compare. And the gun control set of questions, there was one chatbot that came out as being relatively conservative on average, and that was Elon Musk's Grok fun mode that they have. And that was interesting. But all the other ones were liberal. And as you mentioned beforehand, if you compare the results that we had in March with the results that we've had in August now, there's been a clear shift to the left on crime questions. I mean, I thought it was bad enough to begin with. And with the exception of Elon Musk's Grok, there's been a clear shift to the left on gun control issues. Uh, uh, Elon Musk's Grok has shifted so far to the conservative side that it's kind of partially offset the general movement in all the other chatbots that are there. But there's still a small shift to the left, even with his in there.
Wow. Wow, that is shocking and obviously not good for. I mean, I used to be that getting an education expanded your world, but I guess it depends on what kind of education you get, what kind of news sources you choose to follow, and people may not even realize the bias in these AI. So I'm glad you're doing this research, and I hope people. I
Well,
mean,
at least they can kind of see which ones are the most liberally biased.
right,
Like something like Facebook's Llama has regularly been the worst. Google's Chatbot has been very bad too. But you know, they at least have some idea when they go and ask these different chatbots questions where they're coming from, and hopefully that helps kind of make them at least somewhat aware of the types of answers that they're getting.
now you mentioned that something about the death penalty. I'm just curious, does the use of the death penalty reduce homicides or I mean I'm curious. I mean what the research
Well, I
says.
think the evidence is fairly strong that the death penalty reduces murders, and that's the question that was asked.
Right.
Um, uh, so, hey, look, you see this many times. You see these mass murderers, and they'll do a plea bargain to
Right.
have the death penalty taken off the table. They
Right.
really don't care if spending life in prison, so they go and kill, 16 people or 10 people or whatever, they're going to have, 10 life sentences or 16 life sentences. So it's not like they're going to be getting out. They're going to have to spend the rest of their life in prison. But they would much rather have that apparently than the death penalty. And so they'll even forego a trial, just accept a plea bargain if you take the death penalty off the table. So that the fact that you see that over and over and over again in these mass murders cases and the few that live and aren't killed at the crime scene, that provides some evidence about what these criminals think about this.
Okay, and now before we close, I know you've done some research about elections, and could you talk about the research that you've done in that area?
Right. Well, we have papers. People can see this. If you go to ssrn.com and just search under Lott, the top paper that will come out will be some research that I did while I was at the Department of Justice on vote fraud type issues. I think there has been significant vote fraud in the 2020 election. I don't know if you want me to get into the weeds on this. There's other research that I've done that I think is easier to get across to people quickly. And that is just comparing the voting rules in the United States versus other countries. And what you find is that the United States is a big outlier when it comes to this. You look at Europe, for example, there are 47 countries in Europe, 46 and a half of them require government issued photo IDs to be able to go and vote. Canada and Mexico require government issued photo IDs to be able to go and vote. Mexico also has a thumbprint. Most countries ban absentee ballots, let alone the types of mail-in ballots that we saw during the 2020 election, where they just automatically sent it out to people. In Europe, of those 47 countries, 35 of them completely ban absentee ballots for people living in the country. Another 10 allow it, but you have to go in person with the government issued photo ID in order to pick it up. They will not send you the absentee ballot in the mail. And 6 of those 10 countries limited even further to people who will be in the hospital or in military service. And they won't just take your word for it that you're going to be in the hospital on that date or be in military service. You have to have third-party verification from the hospital or the military that you will be unavailable to go and vote on that day before they'll give it to you. So there's only 2 countries in Europe that have absentee ballot rules, which are anywhere similar to what we see here in the United States. Mexico bans absentee ballots for people living in its country, and for many years banned it even for people living outside of Mexico. So, you know, and the thing is, many of these countries used to have rules similar to what we have in the United States, but they discovered massive vote fraud. France, for example, had absentee ballot rules up until 1975 that were similar to what we have in the United States. And it was only by accident because, or I don't know, by accident, but a couple of people ended up having a guilty conscience about the massive vote buying that was occurring and dead people voting, that they went to prosecutors, and the French government discovered the vote fraud and then banned absentee ballots. So this isn't something that's surprising. And the thing is, a lot of people don't know or have forgotten the history in the United States. Secret ballots are a relatively recent phenomenon in U.S. history. The first state with secret ballots was Kentucky in 1880. The last state to adopt secret ballots was South Carolina in 1950. And so, and the reason why they did that, it used to be you'd have a ballot box up in the front of the room, and people would go up and they drop a colored piece of paper in the ballot box based upon which party they wanted to vote for. And you'd have representatives of the parties stand on either side of the ballot box, and they could see how people were voting, and they would pay people based on how they voted. And so a big reason for moving to secret ballots was to reduce people being paid for how they were voting. And when they did that, there was about a 10 percentage point drop in the voter turnout rate, because it turns out when you stop paying people for voting, a number of people stopped voting. It wasn't worthwhile for them to go and vote. But but at the same time, there are all sorts of rules about absentee ballots and other things, because they knew if you had an absentee ballot, you could still pay people for how they voted, because they could vote their absentee ballot and then you could show them. When you had secret ballots, otherwise, you could tell the parties how you had voted, but they couldn't be sure. I mean, you could tell both sides that you had voted for them and try to get paid twice for voting there. And so they banned absentee ballots, or places that allowed absentee ballots would ban vote harvesting, because vote harvesting, it makes it even more clear how you voted, because not only could they see the absentee ballot and see how you voted, but then they could go and have somebody go and make sure that the ballot was actually delivered and voted. And so that made it more worthwhile for them to go and pay the people. So, they've forgotten all these things. And things like having these ballot boxes out around the country. There's no other country in the world that allows that type of thing. The other countries have very strict rules on chain of custody with regard to ballot boxes. The notion of having a ballot box left unattended at 2:00 in the morning out in public is something that, no other country that I've been able to find would even consider as a reasonable option.
Well, I mean, there is one political party that says that requiring voter ID and not allowing mail-in ballot voting and ballot boxes, drop-off boxes, you're suppressing the vote. You're discouraging people from voting.
Right. Well, what I can say, you can look at Mexico, for example.
Yeah.
When Mexico in the early 90s instituted all of its anti-fraud rules that are there, you had to get an ID for voting. It has your thumbprint on it, has a picture you had to go in to go and get the ID and then come back a second time in order to pick it up. They would not send it to you in the mail. In some Mexican states, that may require you travel. There's only one place to get that, so you may have to travel 75 miles to go and apply, and then go back again to pick it up. Um, and banning absentee ballots, you would think that there would be a big drop off in the rate that people voted in Mexico. And yet it surged in the presidential elections afterwards. And the reason was pretty simple. People realized that it was more likely that their votes would actually count at that point. And so, it was worthwhile for them to go and bear those additional costs.
Well, we really appreciate all of your research and expertise. It truly is inspiring. I do want to encourage people to go to Crime Research Prevention Center
.org.
.org. Yeah, crimeresearch.org. And yeah, let me just go to your homepage here.
Well, it's just if you click on there you go.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, there's a lot of really valuable research here, and it's very worthwhile and very informative. Uh, Dr. Lott, we thank you again for taking time out for our viewers, and we really appreciate your work, and we really appreciate you. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Appreciate it.